Once again, I'm Joseph Evans, and I have the privilege, I like to call it the privileged responsibility to serve as the director of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice Center. I am to offer devotion this morning as well as a few housekeeping notes, and I'd ask you to give me your attention as we go over just a few things here at the outset. First of all, before anything else, I want to thank our staff who has put this together from beginning to end, the people that you and I do not see, who get up very early in the morning prior to our arrival. Every chair, every table that we're sitting in, someone did that from our building and grounds. And after we are through this afternoon, they will come in and tear this down and rebuild it for a lecture. Also want to thank our Institution Advancement Office, who literally have made sure that all of these parts and pieces are put together in a very, very fine way. Little things like, for example, these purple coverings. That's the word I'm looking for. But they are coverings. But stained, frankly, yesterday when we were here, and people literally took them up. And, well, one person took them up and took them home, washed them again, and brought them back. Just small details to make this what it is. And also our audio and visual team that are here as well. And I'm sure there are others that people will think about, but I wanted to make sure that I said that. Others who are using your own computers, I think the information that you need are on the table, but it's carpi dash underscore, thank you, $ student. That doesn't go together, $ and student, but we'll use it here today. But that, I think you'll be able to do that. Now, here's what I need us to do. Today, as we adjourn from this particular meeting, I want you now to choose one person from your table. And that person ideally would have been here both days, but pick a person from your table, and that person will be interviewed after all of this is over, and you will answer one question. What's the big takeaway that you got from this 2-day session? They'll put the microphone on you, they'll turn on the camera, and you'll have approximately 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes to answer that question. So you really should be...
It's for the camera, but not for the audience. So it's not like it's just for the, so you can do it in private, not a big, like you're not doing it in front of everyone.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, you're not going to be doing that. You're going to be doing like a street interview. You're walking down the street, and that person stops you and asks you the question. Fortunately, you know what the question is. What is the big takeaway for the 2 days that you've learned here? So you'll pick one person from your table to be representative for the rest of us. So after this period, then we will start with our panel discussion. You see our panel is already in place, including Judge Bereola, who will be joining us in just a moment. How does Christian nationalism threaten Christianity and religious freedom, Then the table talks will take place, and we have a table leader to kind of guide us. You have a list of questions for these days that can help us to stay on task. And then we'll have lunch, and I assume, again, it's just going to be across here in Fleming. Is that correct? Lunch?
Like yesterday, same thing.
Yeah, okay. So we'll just walk out the door here and go across to Fleming. And then we will have the fourth panel, what can we do? Now, we hope that Dr. Amanda Tyler will be here, but if she's not, Brian Leander and Dr. Brian Leander and Dr. Dwight Webster will fill in the blanks, and we'll get that done. Table talk, report out, closing comments, and then these individual interviews with the videographer. And then we will have a break, and then we'll prepare for our lecture for the evening. Please remember this, if you could, you have these really neat, what do you call this, Dean?
Bucket
Buckslip, and the Berkeley School of Theology, the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice. Decolonizing theological education locally, globally, to renew, reconstruct, and repair churches, communities, and the world through reflection, critique, and practice. A focus on that decolonizing theological education, that's very, very important. That obviously suggests that we've been working with a colonized theology, and that's not going to help us in the 21st century. But equally, that is not on this card, we are also interested in the reconstruction, and we call it, as others do, the third reconstruction that's taking place. Third reconstruction that's taking place, hopefully. I don't know if we're in the Reconstruction or we're in the Second Civil War. We're going to find out in a few days, and we'll see what happens. I hope we are, maybe they can be simultaneous since they are, philosophical constructs. I don't know. But I would prefer that we're in the third Reconstruction. So I ask that all of you do your civic duty and go out and vote. All right, I think that is all for me at this time. And now I want to shift to devotion for just a minute. Incidentally, I know that no one has asked me to plug this book, but I am reading this book, Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, Anne Applebaum, who is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize on a book that she did on the Gulag. She's also written a book called The Twilight of Democracy that preceded this book. I'm reading them out of order. I'm reading this one, and I'm not bragging or complaining, but one thing God has provided for me is I can read really fast. And I've only had this book for 2 days, and I've only got to page 33, because every page and every word is it's just so powerful that I don't want to read it fast. I just want to take in what she's saying, and this is perhaps the most relevant piece of work that I've read, that it will certainly help us understand the times that we're living in. So do yourself a favor. I'm going to be using this in these little sermons I do across the country, the little things I do. But I can talk about this too. In fact, I want to segue to something that I think will be important. When I was a college kid, I pledged a fraternity, and in pledging my fraternity, I had to hide from the brothers, because in those days, the brothers pledged you. And I hid in the place that would have been the least likely for them to look for me, the library. And I was in the library on the top floor, and in those days they had the cubicles. You wouldn't have a cubicle like this now. You had the plywood doors on it where you couldn't see in it, but in those days they had those kind of things. So I would literally go in there and hide. I wish I was in there studying, but I was hiding. And one day I got kind of careless, and I was just kind of hanging out up there in the library looking around, and I heard them coming up the steps. And I looked and I said, I don't have enough time to run back to my little cubicle. What am I going to do? So I just froze. And a couple of brothers went over and they saw the cubicle door open. They said, I know he's here somewhere. But I literally hid in plain sight. And they turned around and started walking back down the steps, and I was shaking like a leaf. But while I was doing so, I was looking through the stacks like this. And I looked over in the distance, and it's amazing, I had really good eyesight then. If I take my glasses off now, I can't see very well. But I saw over there something that said W.E.B. Du Bois, and I saw other books, and I went, So I walked around and went and looked, and there was also hiding in plain sight, literally a major section on what black people had written. And I had never seen that many books. I'd seen Up From Slavery and those books because my grandmother made me read it. I didn't know what it meant, but I read it because I was a little boy. She exposed me as she could. But I think that I had an intellectual baptism there. Later to find out what Augustine meant by intellectual baptism. I had mine and did not know what I had. But I had literally at that point had changed my mind that I could be something more than playing sports and so forth, and that I actually could do something with my life. I also read a book called Dark Water, published in 1940, that I think it was probably, in my opinion, it may have been Dr. Du Bois' magnum opus. Most of us have heard of The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, but in 1940 he wrote Dark Water. I want to make a comparison about, perhaps you can put it in context for yourselves, but we're here to talk about the threats in some respects of Christian nationalism or Christian white nationalism or nationalism as we understand as you're defining it. I want to compare the Apostles' Creed with what Du Bois wrote in Dark Water that he called the Credo. And then I want you to determine on what side of the tracks were these written from. Here's the Apostles' Creed. We all know it, I think. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he arose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven, and he's seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there, he will come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Amen. I believe in God, who made of one blood all nations, that on earth do dwell. I believe that all men, black, brown, and white, are brothers, varying from time and opportunity, in form and gift and feature, but differing in no essential particular, and alike in soul and the possibility of infinite development. Especially do I believe in the Negro race, in the beauty of its genius, the sweetness of its soul, and its strength in that meekness which shall yet inherit this turbulent earth. I believe in the pride of race and lineage and self, and pride of self so deep as to scorn injustice to other selves, and pride of lineage so great as to despise no man's father, and pride of race so chivalrous as neither to offer bastardly to the weak, nor beg wedlock of the strong, knowing that men may be brothers in Christ, even though they may be not brothers-in-law. I believe in service, humble, reverent service, from the blackening of the boots to the whitening of souls, for work is heaven, idleness is hell, and wage is the well done of the master, who summoned all of them that labor and are heavy laden, making no distinction between the black, sweating cotton hands of Georgia and the first families of Virginia, since all distinction are not based on deed, is devilish and not divine. I believe in the devil and his angels, who wantonly worked to narrow the opportunities of struggling human beings, especially if they be black, who spit in their faces of the fallen to strike them that cannot strike again, believe the worst and work to prove it, hating the image which is their maker stamped on a brother's soul. I believe in the Prince of Peace. I believe that war is murder. I believe that armies and navies are at bottom the tinsel and braggadocio of oppression and wrong. And I believe that the wicked conquests of weaker and darker nations by nations whiter and stronger are foreshadows the death of that strength. I believe in the liberty of all men, the space to stretch his arms and their souls, the right to breathe and the right to vote, the freedom to choose their friends, enjoy the sunshine, and ride on the railroads uncursed by color, thinking, dreaming, working as they will in a kingdom of beauty and love. I believe in the training of children, black even as white, the leading out of little souls into green pastures and beside all the still waters, not for peace, but for life, lit by some large vision of beauty and goodness and strength, lest we forget that the sons of the fathers like Esau for mere meat barter their birthright in a mighty nation. And finally, I believe in patience with the weakness of the weak and the strength of the strong, the prejudice of the ignorant and the ignorant of the blind, patience with tardy triumph of joy and the mad chastening of sorrow. You can tell from these readings that there is a view from the other side of the tracks. Which side of the tracks were you born on?
Give me that mic, Jim. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Evans, for that really very meaningful devotion. I appreciate it. Okay, so we are moving to our third panel discussion this morning. How does Christian nationalism threaten Christianity and religious freedom? We have a great panel before us. We have Dr. James Brenneman, who also happens to be the president of Berkeley School of Theology, but he is a Hebrew Bible scholar and has spent a lot of years studying Judaism as well as what's going on in Israel. So he's going to bring us a little something in that vein. We have Dr. Park this morning, Dr. Sam Park, who is one of our professors of preaching. And he has been with us now for many years. I don't even know how many, Dr. Park. But he will bring to us something on immigration. And we have Dr. Sias, who is a professor here in biblical studies, right? We call it biblical. Your title is biblical studies, yes. And he's going to bring us something on hermeneutics, how to think about interpretation and so on. And then we have Judge Gail Bereola, who, yes, the honorary. And she's going to help us think about the separation of church and state. Being a judge, I'm sure she will have some very helpful words on that. So, welcome, panelists. And I'm going to hand you the mic now, and you may begin. Thank you. And as usual, I'm going to have my timer, 10 minutes. All right. Thank you.
Good morning. I am a Christian Zionist. And I've been asked to address the question, how does the phenomenon of Jewish nationalism as a parallel to Christian nationalism threaten religious freedom, if not Judaism itself? Christian and Jewish nationalists have literally hijacked and so distorted and so transformed the very meaning of otherwise wonderful words like Christian or Zionist. So if you're shocked by me calling myself a Christian Zionist, I have made my point already. Yet, I and likely you, and especially Jews, are no longer free to use this formulation in civil discourse. Frankly, I feel practically forced to give up equally on both terms. Perhaps a better self-description would be that I am no longer a Christian then. Rather, I am a follower of Jesus, the Jewish non-Christian Palestinian refugee laborer, my teacher, Savior, and Lord. And perhaps, just maybe, I can still find joy in singing with gusto that old hymn, "We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God." If you, like me, have traveled many times, studied and lived for months in Israel-Palestine over the last 35 years, you might agree with me that Jerusalem, Yerushalmi, city of peace, resting upon Mount Zion, now for some 5,000 years, is indeed one of the beautiful wonders of the world, rightfully claimed as it is by the three great Abrahamic faith traditions to this day, nationalist state claims notwithstanding. Since I can't solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 10 minutes, let me focus on a more realistic task to argue in the time I have how religious nationalisms have hijacked language for their own purposes, often foreclosing on the use of otherwise biblical, historic, neutral, or positive terms, often prophetic terms, that we wish to use. I just gave you the example of the distortion that Christian nationalism has created for me in even using the word Christian. I'll return below to the word Zionist. Oklahoma just passed a law that the Bible has to be taught in every school classroom, grades 5 through 12. And not just any Bible, it must include a copy of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Ten Commandments. And the license of a teacher who doesn't teach using it could be suspended. It so happens that the only Bible so far printed with those documents in it is the Trump Bible. And I ask us, for God's sake, what's wrong with the word woke? The Bible asks us to be woke or awake some 50 times, and many, many more times if you use synonyms. Awake, my soul, awake, the psalmist says over and over. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Stay awake with me, Jesus says on the Gethsemane high point with his disciples. Wake up, for your salvation is near, Apostle Paul says to the Romans. People in the orbit of Christian nationalism, in my humble opinion, the very folks Scripture is warning to wake up, have turned this holy warning into a political bludgeon against the truly woke among us. That's not good. In a similar manner, religious nationalisms have practically ruined for use the ancient biblical terms of Zion and Zionist. In Ben Ohlenberger's groundbreaking book, Zion, the City of the Great King, he argues that the biblical Zion symbolizes the presence of Yahweh enthroned in the ark, first in Shiloh and then later in the temple. Yahweh is worshipped there as the sole protector for security and justice, especially for the poor, against the proud and the arrogant. And the proud and arrogant here are those people who amass militarized horses and chariots and foreign alliances for security instead of God. The specific ethical dimensions of security in Zion, however, is made conditional on the posture of the community, how they treat others, especially the widow, orphan, immigrant, and poor among them. Zion, you see, can be a prophetic criticism of the nationalisms of exclusivist, militarized, and privileged sort. Jump with me ahead in time to the late 19th and 20th century. The late great philosopher Martin Buber of the I Thou fame, in his book and writings on Zionism, argued that Zionism was not primarily a political issue, but a vision, a metaphor, an idea that implies a reorientation of one's entire vision. It's a metaphor. It means, he says, of overcoming a diaspora mentality, a catharsis, offering a readiness to build in the land of Israel-Palestine a new, just, free, and creative community, what he calls a homeland. Central to his thesis was that this distinction between the idea of a Jewish homeland and of a Jewish state he rejected the latter while embracing the former. He argued that Zionism should not aspire to create a Jewish nation state, as such an arrangement would deny the full equality to Palestinians. Buber described the nation-state version of Zionism as a distorted, false ideology that would require the militarized, industrialized, politicized, occupying force of the state over Palestinians that exists today. The biblical rabbinic word for such a state might rightly be called out as avodah zarah, in Hebrew meaning strange worship. The strange worship of strange gods, of kings, of ideologies, of power centers, of empires. In other words, idolatry. Sadly, not understanding the prophetic use of Zion in the Bible, or Buber's and others' more nuanced definitions of Zionism, too many of us have simply adopted the Jewish religious nationalist definition of Zionism, tied as it is to a 19th century Jewish nationalist state movement. This becomes clear to me when we loosely throw around terms like Zionism is racism, or assume Zionism requires, by definition, the establishment of an exclusive Jewish state. In so doing, we have cut short the prophetic imagination of the prophets of old, and even of many Jews in the Reform, Orthodox, and Hasidic religious movements during the pre-state era of modern Israel, who argued against a Jewish nationalist state. Some still do. I lament that today the Jewish movements of Jewish Voice for Peace, B'Tselem, if not now, are called by others or forced to self-define as anti-Zionist because the Jewish nationalists have usurped Buber's and the Bible's prophetic, inclusive, homelanders' view of prophetic Zionism. Even Webster's dictionary reveals the change in status of the term Zionist over time in its definition. Quote, Zionism is an international movement originally for the establishment of a Jewish homeland or a religious community in Palestine, and later for the support of the modern state of Israel. Lest we become too self-righteous and performative in our denunciations of Jewish nationalist idolatries, let us remember we here today live, work, and study in this very room on the unceded, occupied ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples of the Bay Area. This was their homeland for 10,000 years until Christian manifest destiny with its racially motivated pioneer expansionism and missionary zeal robbed them of it. At least the Jewish equivalent land grab had the moral argument of needing a homeland for Jews fleeing the Holocaust. What's our excuse? I do not expect anyone here to necessarily uproot their life because of this realization, but I think that honesty calls us to put our protests in context. It is my sincere belief, by God's grace, that it may still be possible to recover such a homeland view of Zionism that might emerge from the ruins of October 7th, from years of brutal occupation, genocidal responses to suicide bombings, generations of trauma, and age-old religious hatreds. Could it be a two-state solution? Perhaps. Might it be a one federated United States of Israel-Palestine if you're Israeli, or United States of Palestine-Israel if you're Palestinian? With all the equal rights, separation of religion and state, and a pluralistic democracy? One would hope it could be possible. One last paragraph. In conclusion, religious nationalisms undermine the legitimate aspirations of Jews, Palestinians, and anyone else, for that matter, including Christians, non-believers, immigrant, and indigenous peoples seeking a homeland free from persecution, be it for one's religious, political, social beliefs, or racial ethnic identity. Religious nationalisms rob us of our own use of biblical language, prophetic language, of freedom of speech, and therefore the biblical vision of a homeland that is truly expansive, inclusive, stretching toward the universal, welcoming home every creature, human and otherwise. The quest for such a homeland is a noble ideal, straight out of Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, a biblical vision of a people of every kindred, tribe, and tongue. And Micah says, each in the name of their own God, flowing up to where? the top of Mount Zion, beating their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and studying war no more. Amen.
Nicole Delgado is a professor at Hunter College in New York City. I found her 2019 article entitled "The Colonial Roots of White Supremacy, Lessons from Latinx History" on a website called Latinx. This is what Delgado says, I quote, "We have entered a new era of white supremacy in the United States. From the separation of families at the US-Mexico border to the criminalization of refugees and the rise of hate crimes, we in the Latinx community may feel overwhelmed and uncertain about our political future. Yet today's anti-immigrant, anti-Latinx rhetoric is not a recent development. Rather, it has some of its earliest roots in the dispossession of Mexican Americans in the 1840s under Manifest Destiny, and in their lynching in the 1920s under Jim Crow, among other racist policies and practices. It is therefore essential for us to recall this history of repression under white supremacy and resistance to it, unquote. I have another quote from Kathy Young, who is a retired Presbyterian minister who lives in Iowa. Her article is also available under the title of "Christian Nationalism, a Grave Threat to America." In that article, Young mentions Hitler's strategy to build loyalty and support within German churches during World War II, saying, I quote, "Hitler encouraged kids in his German youth organizations to get their families to attend Sunday worship with them. Church attendance skyrocketed. Pastors were thrilled. Eventually, Germany's government rule and religion became one. We know the rest of the story. Hitler and his followers' persecution of Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, blacks, disabled people, gays, and etc. Sadly, only a handful of German clergy confronted Hitler," unquote. And then she said, "The threat is a Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism wants to bring America's church and state into one entity, just like Hitler did, which is incompatible with the most basic principle of our democratic framework." And she adds, "Christian nationalism is fueled by white supremacy, the belief that white people are superior to those of other races and should dominate them." And then finally she adds, "The gospel, which means good news, is always a gift. It should never be used as a weapon." When it comes to immigration issues, I always think of my own journey as an immigrant. I came to this country in 1991 on a student visa. A month after my departure, my wife gave birth to my daughter, and they had to remain in Korea for almost 5 years because they were denied a visa to come and join me in the United States. Their denial was because the people at the U.S. consulate in Seoul thought that I was not attending school in the United States, although I had been a full-time student. 30 plus years later, I still wonder what made them think I was not attending school. They didn't even ask me to submit any proof of a document that I was attending school. For me, that was white supremacy. The United States is made up of immigrants and still needs immigrants. Without immigrants, I don't think that this country will function as it has been. This is true not just in this country. In Korea, for example, due to the decrease of a population, and young people do not have babies anymore. Many businesses and companies are struggling with an insufficient workforce. And many foreign workers are filling the vacancies of low-paying manual jobs. However, the increase in foreign workers on us and them mindset has brought many social problems. And some Christians voice their concerns against the Muslims, just like in this country. The barriers between racial and ethnic groups are hard to overcome everywhere. In this country, Christian nationalism divides the gap further instead of narrowing it. Christian nationalism has nothing to do with the Christian gospel. They only use the name for their political agenda. In that extreme political ideology, non-white and non-Christian, especially people like Muslims, are not favored in the discussion of immigration or even demonized in social discourse in this nation. This violates the very core, not only of a democratic principle, but also the Christian belief. The biblical mandate and Christian hospitality demand that we be compassionate toward those in need and provide shelter and food. Skin color or religion should not be a factor in that outreach. Christianity was born out of a chaotic world where Jews and the Gentiles conflicted. And a disparity between the rich and the poor were prevalent in the first century Palestine under the occupation of the Roman Empire. It has been to bring peace and unity to the world, not through the ideology of one dominant racial or cultural group, but through the love of God that was shown in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. My question is, as Christian leaders, are we strong enough to implement our biblical vision? In her article, Laura Alexander describes that when Proposition 187 was on the ballot in 1994, it was a fight within and among Christian communities, meaning that while she said, most Christian leaders opposed the policy of denying health and education services to illegal immigrants. Almost 60% of Californians voted for it. Alexander suggests that this is a sign of the waning of religious leaders' power to move their communities. Then what is the solution, especially today when church membership and influence are declining in our communities?
I got my time. Okay. So I would like to begin this presentation with what I argue is the most important quote in biblical interpretation by the great Renita Weems and her article titled, "Do You See What I See? Diversity in Interpretation." So, quote, "It is not the Bible that is authoritative. After all, the Bible is a document that waits to be interpreted. It is one interpretation over the other that is authoritative. And that interpretation is not adjudicated solely on the basis of reasonableness, accuracy, truth, and logic. It is adjudicated most often on the basis of power. One interpreting community acquires a power, e.g., in the legal, political, ecclesiastical, pedagogical arenas, to assert and propagate its interpretation over all others. In other words, people have power, not texts." End quote. And that is why I'm here today, to speak of a power, a subtle yet insidious power that seeks not divine revelation through sacred texts, but instead endeavors to install a political revelation into God, the Word of God. At its core, Christian nationalism is anchored in a fundamental claim: God has revealed his word to me. This belief, though shared by many well-intentioned Christians in their interpretive journey, becomes the bedrock of an alt-right agenda that betrays its true motives in that it reveals that it is not the divine word of God that guides Christian nationalists, but it is their path that violently breaches into God's mouth to produce their manipulated word. Simply put, their path is not guided by revelation. It violently shapes the word of God to reflect their desired outcome. This self-proclaimed divine authority extends its reach into the realms of intolerance, hate, and authoritarianism, like the tentacles of benevolent force grasping at the political and religious spheres alike. At the heart of the Christian nationalist hermeneutic, we can find this claim: our interpretation alone is divinely inspired, inerrant, and based on a literal reading. All who oppose it and us are America-hating demons. So, thus says the Christian nationalist hermeneutic, quote, "The parable of the Good Samaritan is not about helping the stranger, but about one's immediate neighbor. It's about America taking care of its own, not the foreigner. So to hell with Christ's message of seeing the individual whom you find diametrically opposed to everything you believe as a human being deserving of the highest love." End quote. Thus says the Christian nationalist hermeneutic, quote, "The second coming of Christ will not be Jesus. It's the arrival of Donald Trump, the political deliverer and messianic savior of America, a nation God has ordained as a light to all other nations. So to hell with the divine hopes of spiritual deliverance found in the apocalyptic messianic expectations many of the prophets meant to convey." End quote. And yes, there is a book out there titled President Donald Trump, the Son of Man, the Christ. Thus says the Christian nationalist, quote, "America, then, is a Christian nation, a nation guided by biblical laws, interpreted solely on the basis of our agenda. So to hell with what America actually stands for and its fundamental opposition to divine right theory, because in this case, divine right benefits our cause." End quote. Herein lies a paradox of the Christian nationalist hermeneutic. Indeed, its fundamental strength and weakness. It espouses a religious zeal that is flagrantly antithetical to the teachings of the very figure its adherents claim to love with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their mind. And in its patriotic fervor, this ideology undermines the very values of the nation its adherents claim to vigorously defend. Why such a blatant contradiction? The answer is clear: power. Now, it grieves me to acknowledge this, but such is the result when a society perpetuates a belief in a cosmic battle between good and evil. It reinforces the dualities that fuel tribalism, essential to the blight that is Christian nationalist worldview. For in the context of Christian nationalism, it is not about faith and devotion to God. It is about the appropriation of religious language and declarations commonly expressed by people of faith to legitimize their position through so-called divine sanction. I cannot think of a more egregious violation of carrying the Lord's name in vain than this. Now, as a Latino in the United States who has experienced many levels of racism since childhood, I see clearly that Christian nationalism is not a new phenomenon. It just has a name now. And as a biblical scholar of color whose work was and is often relegated to the contextual theories not meant for academia proper, I am, you could say, comforted by Gadamer's hermeneutical circle and Derrida's deconstruction for leveling the hermeneutical playing field. Yet I am troubled by the implications of the hermeneutical paradigms and the enduring challenges they have raised. If no single standard exists, then all interpretive voices are equally valid and invalid at once. But can this truly be the case when the piercing voice of Christian nationalism drowns out all others? At its core, this ideology poses a profound threat in both society and our shared humanity. It disrupts the delicate balance between the individual and the collective, the symbiotic exchange of giving and receiving, of sacrificing and gaining, that sustains not only a democratic system, but a peaceful space of religious expression. Can we then regard this interpretive stance as valid? Now, as I conclude, I am left with a more pressing question. How does Christian nationalism threaten Christianity and religious freedom? Currently, I can think of two ways, and this is by no means exhaustive because I have only 10 minutes, not a semester, right? First, it stifles critical thought among believers. It discourages open inquiry and diverse interpretive approaches, tempting those who seek affirmation to retreat to a theological echo chamber of like-minded views. Yet as theological educators and church leaders, it is our job, our duty, to create spaces where people are heard and seen, and to empower the church with the knowledge that critical thinking is not the enemy of faith nor biblical interpretation. Blind and unwavering zeal is. Why? The answer leads me to reason two. Christian nationalism fosters division. To secure its lofty proclaimed divine authority, it constructs the dichotomy of us versus them, God versus Satan, a holy versus demonic, granting divine right to the Christian nationalist political agenda, casting its adherents on the side of God and all others as agents of Satan. More dangerous still, this bifurcation, once established, becomes infectious. The more Christian nationalists engage in this divisive rhetoric, the more those opposed to the ideology are drawn to its divisive logic. My plea then is simple. Resist the lure of othering and disunity, for to succumb to it is to succumb to the very malevolence Christian nationalism wields. Indeed, this is how Christianity and religious freedom topple over: division. Christian nationalism threatens to reshape the very essence of Christian belief, of healing the sick, protecting the weak, welcoming the stranger, and most importantly, loving one's enemy, to mirror the very division Christian nationalism so proudly espouses with its hermeneutic of power. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Gail Bereola, and thank you. Use my left. And I'm going to be talking to you about how does Christian nationalism threaten Christianity and religious freedom. And I'll be coming from a viewpoint about the separation of state and church, which we call the separation powers. And so our featured speaker this evening, Amanda Tyler, gave an interview with the Center for American Progress. And in that interview, she expressed her belief that Christian nationalism is antithetical to the separation of powers between church and state, and that Christian nationalism undermines the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. This is because Christian nationalism leads to discrimination and at times violence against religious minorities and those who are non-religious. Christian nationalism has become a rationale by the far right for getting around laws and regulations that are aimed at protecting pluralistic democracy, such as protections for women, for religious minorities, and for the LGBTQI plus people, etc. Today, conflict arises from Christian nationalism because of their anti-democratic notions that America is a nation by and for only Christians. But which Christians are they talking about? Surely, all Christians cannot be painted with one broad brush, because even within Christianity, as we know, people have different viewpoints and don't all think the same. However, Christian nationalists, as a segment of Christians, view themselves as being divinely inspired by revelations from God to give preference to a group of people who hold the Christian values and beliefs as Christian nationalists interpret them. And then they seek to impose these values, even though they discriminate against others. And some believers of Christian nationalist ideology are more prone to support political violence and other anti-democratic ideas, and they seek to establish an exclusionist or white supremacy version of Christianity as the dominant moral and cultural order. Excuse me, I'm dealing with allergies, so my nose is kind of runny. So if I end up... I agree with Ms. Tyler that Christian nationalism is antithetical to the separation of powers of a democratic country like the United States, because the ideology tramples, ultimately, on the freedoms of people who are not Christians, and it disregards the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that all Americans have under the United States Constitution. Christian nationalism threatens to, and in some cases already has, undermine our constitutional rights and can potentially eviscerate the very core of a democratic government that the founders of our nation wanted to be a government for and by the people. And that is something that we continue to aspire to. Instead, Christian nationalists want to replace our democracy with a government that favors a certain group of Christians and their values and beliefs as interpreted by them, to the exclusion of the values and beliefs held by others. And they want to impose their values and beliefs on everyone. This is very dangerous because it threatens to take us back to a time in history where having different beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes that did not fit the box or mold of what some believed to be Christian, quote unquote, could result in one being persecuted, ostracized, and killed It reminds me of the time when some people were accused of being witches. Fortunately, the framers of our Constitution laid the groundwork for the evolution of our thinking when they enacted the separation powers between church and state. The framers believed that a separation between church and state was a good thing and that it would promote the expression of religious freedoms by prohibiting the government from interfering with, discriminating against, and showing preference to some people. In essence, the separation powers as enshrined in the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, guarantees the right to exercise religious freedom by prohibiting Congress from establishing a national religion and prohibiting the American government from discriminating against or favoring groups of people. And I'd like to just take this time, it's very simple, just to read the First Amendment. But before I do that, I'd like to read the preamble of the Constitution of the United States. So the preamble starts, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And the First Amendment So there were a number of amendments, but this was the First Amendment that was enacted in the 1791. And it reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," and I'll just read the entire amendment, "or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." So this is the First Amendment that talks about the freedoms that we all have as individuals of the press, etc. But what we're focused on is the Establishment Clause, or the so-called Establishment Clause. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." So that means no national religion, "or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." That means people can freely exercise their religious freedoms. And so the framers, I think, got it right. This was something that they wanted to aspire to, something that was good, because they could see and envision the dissension that we could have in our society and the chaos that it could cause if the government was establishing a national religion. Specifically, the First Amendment says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press," etc., as I just read. Although Christian nationalists don't reject the First Amendment, they interpret it as inconsequential to their presumed privileged rights as Christians, to the detriment of other Christians who do not subscribe to their presumed privileged rights, and to non-Christians. Thus, they uphold, support, and affirm their right to be Christians, but they discount, disaffirm, and therefore do not really support the right of others who do not subscribe to their views and are not Christians to have and express their religious freedoms. In general, The separation powers of the First Amendment is a philosophical and jurisprudential concept that defines political distance in the relationship between religious organizations in the United States and the government or state. It is a concept that is rooted in the belief that government should not interfere with the religious freedoms of the people, and religion should not control the government. Both should remain separate and free of entanglement. Specifically, the First Amendment preserves and protects a precious right that is embedded in the concept of the separation of church and state. As I previously said, the First Amendment enshrines the separation powers of church and state by prohibiting the government from establishing an official religion, favoring one religion over another, and advancing or inhibiting religion and the exercise of religious freedom. The phrase separation of state is a metaphor that expresses the idea that religious freedom is best protected when the church and state are separate. The concept is thought to have been first mentioned in 1644 by a man named Roger Williams, a Puritan minister who founded Rhode Island and the First Baptist Church in America based on this idea. Williams called for a hedge, quote unquote, of separation between the secular world and the church. He believed that mixing the two would cause both to become corrupt. Williams created a colony where the freedom to worship was a right for all. His way of thinking in this regard influenced American thinking for centuries to come, to the extent that the framers of the Constitution clearly adopted this idea when they framed the language of the Establishment Clause as part of the First Amendment in 1791. Some examples of the separation of church and state that have become part of our legal jurisprudence and laws that have been enforced by our government include, and whether you agree with them or not, they're all rooted in this idea that there should be this separation between church and state. One of them is public schools. Religious instruction in public school generally over the years has been prohibited. That may be changing, but generally that is still the law. Schools can require students to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, but not recite it. Courts have ruled that Christmas trees can be displayed in public schools because they have taken on a secular meaning. However, any display of blatant religious artifacts, such as a nativity scene, would suggest advocacy and therefore would violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And this is all entrenched in case law. Government funds. The government is required to treat religious groups the same as other groups when using government funds. And so it all goes back to we, the people. Student prayer. Mandatory school-wide prayer is considered to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. And I know that there are many of us who argue when prayer was in school, things were better. Now that we have taken prayer out of school, things are worse. And so these are the tensions that we have in our way of thinking, but we're allowed to think that way and not think myopically, not be required to think myopically as Christian nationalists would have us do. So, the founders and the framers of the United States Constitution did not sanction a Christian nation. Instead, they were committed to a government that remains neutral toward all religions. This commitment gave rise to the philosophical and jurisprudential concept known as the separation of church and state. And although the words separation of church and state are not specifically stated in the Constitution, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment expressly prohibits Congress from adopting any form of a national religion and prohibits interfering with the exercise of one's religious freedom. Therefore, Christian nationalism, by its very nature, is antithetical to the separation of church and state and threatens our religious freedom and Christianity as we understand it. Thank you.